When Paul Goodman wrote Growing Up Absurd in 1959, he electrified the public with his description of the shattering impact on the young generation of the spiritual emptiness of contemporary society.
Savior, not the doctor, but the realist. No time for the pictures. I'm on the tube just building, and I grew up on the block with the killers. We was thugging it out, trying to down a few rocks, yeah. Crippin' like back in the 80s. I never shot a 380, I'm trying to kill him, little baby. I was 11 when I got my first Glock, and I'm an Indian chief, yeah. And I'm real proud of it. Except the Christ he live inside of me, even.
Now, 8 years later, it is not spiritual emptiness that is terrifying, but spiritual evil. In 1967, young men of America are fighting, dying, and killing in Asian jungles in a war whose purposes are so ambiguous the whole nation sees with dissent. They are told they are sacrificing for democracy, but the Saigon regime, their ally, is a mockery of democracy, and the black American soldier has himself never experienced democracy. While the war devours the young abroad, at home urban outbreaks pit black youth against young soldiers and guardsmen as racial and economic injustice exhausts human endurance. Prosperity gluts the middle and upper class, while poverty imprisons more than 30 million Americans, and literally starvation stalks rural areas of the South. Crime rises in every segment of society. As diseases are conquered and health improved, mass drug consumption and alcoholism assume epidemic proportions. The alienation of young people from society rises to unprecedented levels, and masses of voluntary exiles emerge as modern gypsies, aimless and empty. This generation is engaged in a cold war, not only with the earlier generation, but with the values of its society. It is not the familiar and normal hostility of the young groping for independence. It has a new quality of bitter antagonism and confused anger, which suggests basic issues are being contested. These are unprecedented attitudes because this generation was born and matured in unprecedented conditions. The generation of the past 25 years cannot be understood without remembering that it has lived during that period through the effects of 4 wars: World War II, the Cold War, the Korean War, and Vietnam. No other generation of young Americans was ever exposed to a remotely similar traumatic experience. Yet, as spiritually and physically abrasive as this may be, it is not the worst aspect of contemporary experience. This is the first generation to grow up in the era of the nuclear bomb, knowing that it may be the last generation of mankind. This is a generation not only of war, but of war in its ultimate revelation. This is a generation that truly has no place to hide and no place to find security. These are evils enough to send reason reeling. And of course, they are not the only ones. All of them form part of the matrix in which this generation's character and experience were formed. The Tempest of Evils provides the answer for those adults who ask why this young generation is so unfathomable, so alienated, and frequently so freakish. For the young people of today, peace and social tranquility are as unreal and remote as knight errantry. Under the impact of social forces unique to their times, young people have splintered into three principal groups, though of course there is some overlap among the three. The largest group of young people is struggling to adapt itself to the prevailing values of our society. Without much enthusiasm, they'd accept the system of government, the economic relationships of the property system, and the social stratifications both engender. But even so, they are a profoundly troubled group and are harsh critics of the status quo. In this largest group, social attitudes are not congealed or determined. They are fluid and suching. Though all recent studies point to the fact that the war in Vietnam is our focus of concern, most of them are not ready to resist the draft or to take clear-cut stands on issues of violence and nonviolence. But their consciences have been touched by the feeling that is growing all over the world of the horror and insanity of war, of the imperative need to respect life, of the urgency of moving past war as a way to solve international problems. So while they will not glorify war, and while they feel ambiguous about America's military posture, this majority group reflects the confusion of the larger society, which is itself caught up in a kind of transitional state of conscience as it moves slowly toward the realization that war cannot be justified in the human future. That is the second group of young people. They are the radicals. They range from moderate to extreme in the degree to which they want to alter the social system. All of them agree that only by structural change can current evils be eliminated, because the roots are in the system rather than in men or in faulty operation. These are a new breed of radicals. Very few adhere to established ideology. Some borrow from old doctrines of revolution, but practically all of them suspend judgment on what the form of a new society must be. They are in serious revolt against old values and have not yet concretely formulated the new ones. They are not repeating previous revolutionary doctrines. Most of them have not even read the revolutionary classics. Ironically, their rebelliousness comes from having been frustrated in seeking change within the framework of the existing society. They tried to build racial equality and met tenacious and vicious opposition. They worked to end the Vietnam War and experienced futility. So they seek a fresh start with new rules and a new order. It is fair to say, though, that at present they know what they don't want rather than what they do want. Their radicalism is growing because the power structure of today is unrelenting in defending not only its social system, but the evils it contains. So naturally, it is intensifying the opposition. What is the attitude of this second radical group to the problem of violence? In a word, mixed. There are young radicals today who are pacifists, and there are many who are armchair revolutionaries, who insist on the political and psychological need for violence. These young theorists of violence elaborately scorn the process of dialogue in favor of the tactics of confrontation. They glorify the guerrilla movement, and especially its new martyr, Che Guevara, and they equate revolutionary consciousness with the readiness to shed blood. But across the spectrum of attitudes towards violence that can be found among the radicals, is that a unifying thread? I think that is, whether they read Gandhi or Frantz Fanon, all the radicals understand the need for action, direct, self-transforming and structure-transforming action. This may be their most creative collective insight. The young people in the third group I mentioned earlier are currently called hippies. They may be traced in a fairly direct line from yesterday's beatniks. The hippies are not only colorful but complex, and in many respects their extreme conduct illuminates a negative effect of society's evils on sensitive young people. While there are variations, those who identify with this group have a common philosophy. They are struggling to disengage from society as that expression of their rejection of it. They disavow responsibility to organize society. Unlike the radicals, they are not seeking change but flight. When occasionally they merge with a peace demonstration, it is not to better the political world but to give expression to their own world. The hardcore hippie is a remarkable contradiction. He uses drugs to turn inward, away from reality, to find peace and security. Yet he advocates love as the highest human value, love which can exist only in communication between people and not in the total isolation of the individual. The importance of the hippies is not in their unconventional behavior, but in the fact that some hundreds of thousands of young people, in turning to a flight from reality, are expressing a profoundly discrediting judgment on the society they emerge from. It seems to me that the hippies will not last long as a mass group. They cannot survive because there is no solution in escape. Some of them may persist by solidifying into a secular religious sect. Their movement already has many such characteristics. We might see some of them establish utopian colonies, like the 17th and 18th century communities established by sects that profoundly opposed the existing order and its values. Those communities did not survive, but they were important to their contemporaries because their dream of social justice and human value continues as a dream of mankind. In this context, one dream of the hippie group is very significant. That is its dream of peace. Most of the hippies are pacifists, and a few have thought their way through to a persuasive and psychologically sophisticated peace strategy. And society at large may be more ready now to learn from that dream than it was a century or two ago, to listen to the argument for peace, not as a dream, but as a practical possibility, something to choose and use. From this quick tour of the three main groupings of our young people, it should be evident that this generation is in substantial ferment. Even the large group that is not disaffected from society is putting forward basic questions, and its restlessness helps to account for the radicals with their angry protest and the hippies with their systematic withdrawal. When the less sensitive supporters of the status quo try to argue against some of these condemnations and challenges, they usually cite the technological marvels our society has achieved. However, that only reveals their poverty of spirit. Mammoth productive facilities with computer minds, cities that engulf the landscape and pierce the clouds, planes that almost outrace time, these are awesome, but they cannot be spiritually inspiring. Nothing in our glittering technology can raise man to new heights because material growth has been made an end in itself. In the absence of moral purpose, man himself becomes smaller as the works of man become bigger. Another distortion in the technological revolution is that instead of strengthening democracy at home, it has helped to eviscerate it. Gargantuan industry and government, woven into an intricate, computerized mechanism, leaves a person outside. The sense of participation is lost. The feeling that ordinary individuals influence important decisions vanishes, and man becomes separated and diminished. When an individual is no longer a true participant, when he no longer feels a sense of responsibility to his society, the content of democracy is emptied. When culture is degraded and vulgarity enthroned, when the social system does not build security but induces peril, inexorably the individual is impelled to pull away from a soulless society. This process produces alienation, perhaps the most pervasive and insidious development in contemporary society. Alienation is not confined to our young people, but it is rampant among them. Yet alienation should be foreign to the young. Growth requires connection and trust. Alienation is a form of living death. It is the acid of despair that dissolves society. Up to now, I have been looking at the tragic factors in the quarter century of history that today's youth has lived through. But is that another side? Are there forces in that quarter century that could reverse the process of alienation? We now must go back over those 25 years to search for positive ingredients which have been there, but in relative obscurity. Against the exaltation of technology, there has always been a force struggling to respect higher values. None of the current evils rose without resistance, nor have they persisted without opposition. During the early 1950s, the hangman operating within the Cold War troops was McCarthyism. For years, it decimated social organizations, throttled free expression, and intimidated into bleak silence not only liberals and radicals, but men in high and protected places. A very small band of courageous people fought back, braving ostracism, slander, and loss of livelihood. Gradually and painfully, however, the democratic instinct of Americans was awakened, and the ideological brute force was rooted. By the way, Canada played a valuable role. CBC Radio produced a satire of extraordinary brilliance on McCarthyism entitled The Investigator, which was recorded and widely circulated in the United States with devastating effect. However, McCarthyism left a legacy of social paralysis. Fear persisted through succeeding years, and social reform remained inhibited and defensive. A blanket of conformity and intimidation conditioned young and old to exalt mediocrity and convention. Criticism of the social order was still imbued with implications of treason. The war in Korea was unpopular, but it was never subject to the such criticism and mass demonstrations that currently characterize the opposition to the war in Vietnam. The blanket of fear was lifted by Negro youth. When they took their struggle to the streets, a new spirit of resistance was born. Inspired by the boldness and ingenuity of Negroes, white youth stirred into action and formed an alliance that aroused the conscience of the nation. It is difficult to exaggerate the creative contribution of young Negroes. They took nonviolent resistance, first employed in Montgomery, Alabama, in mass dimensions, and developed original forms of application, sit-ins, freedom rides, and wade-ins. To accomplish these, they first transformed themselves. Young Negroes had traditionally imitated whites in dress, conduct, and thought in a rigid middle-class pattern. Gunnar Myrdal described them as exaggerated Americans. Now they ceased imitating and began initiating. Leadership passed into the hands of Negroes, and their white allies began learning from them. This was a revolutionary and wholesome development for both. It is ironic that today so many educators and sociologists are seeking methods to instill middle-class values in Negro youth as an ideal in social development. It was precisely when young Negroes threw off their middle-class values that they made an historic social contribution. They abandoned those values when they put careers and wealth in a secondary role, when they cheerfully became jailbirds and troublemakers, when they took off their Brooks Brothers attire and put on overalls to work in the isolated rural South. They challenged and inspired white youth to emulate them. Many left school not to abandon learning, but to seek it in more direct ways. They were constructive school dropouts, a variety that strengthened society and themselves. These Negro and white youth preceded the conception of the Peace Corps, and it is safe to say that their work was the inspiration for its organization on an international scale. The collective effort that was born out of the Civil Rights Alliance was awesomely fruitful for this century in the first years of the 1960s. The repressive forces that had not been seriously challenged for almost a decade now faced an aroused adversary. A torrent of humanist thought and action swept across the land, scoring first small and then larger victories. The awakening grew in breadth, and the contested issues encompassed other social questions. A phalanx of reliable young activists took protests from hiding and revived a sense of responsible rebellion. A peace movement was born. The Negro freedom movement would have been historic and worthy even if it had only served the cause of civil rights. But its laurels are greater because it stimulated a broader social movement that elevated the moral level of the nation. In the struggle against the preponderant evils of the society, decent values were preserved. Moreover, a significant body of young people learned that in opposing the tyrannical forces that were crushing them, they added stature and meaning to their lives. The alliance of Negro and white youth that fought bruising engagements with the status quo inspired each other with a sense of moral mission, and both gave the nation an example of self-sacrifice and dedication. These years, the late 60s, are the most crucial time for the movement I have been describing. That is a sense in which it can be said that the civil rights and peace movements are over, at least in their first form, the protest form, which gave them their first victories. That is a sense in which the alliance of responsible young people, which the movement represented, has fallen apart under the impact of failures, discouragement, and consequent extremism and polarization. The movement for social change has entered a time of temptation to despair, because it is clear now how deep and systematic are the evils it confronts. That is a strong temptation to despair of programs and actions, and to dissipate energy in hysterical talk. That is a temptation to break up into mutually suspicious extremist groups in which blacks reject the participation of whites and whites reject the realities of their own history. But meanwhile, as the young people face this crisis, leaders in the movement are working out programs to bring the social movements through from their early and now inadequate protest phase to a new stage of massive, active, nonviolent resistance to the evils of the modern system. As this work and this planning proceed, we begin to glimpse tremendous vistas of what it might mean for the world if the new programs of resistance succeed in forging an even wider alliance of today's awakened youth. Nonviolent, active resistance to social evils, including massive civil disobedience when there is need for it, can unite in a new action synthesis the best insights of all three groups I have pointed out among our young people. From the hippies, it can accept the vision of peaceful means to a goal of peace, and also their sense of beauty, gentleness, and of the unique gifts of each man's spirit. From the radicals, it can adopt the burning sense of urgency, the recognition of the need for direct and collective action, and the need for strategy and organization. And because the emerging program is neither one of anarchy nor of despair, it can welcome the work and insights of those young people who have not rejected our present society in its totality. They can challenge the more extreme groups to integrate the new vision into history as it actually is, into society as it actually works. They can help the movement not to break the bruised reed or quench the smoking wick of values that are already recognized in the society we want to change. And they can help open the possibility of honorable compromise. If the early civil rights movement bore some international fruit in the formation of a Peace Corps, this new alliance could do far more. Already our best young workers in the United States are talking about the need to organize in international dimensions. They are beginning to form conscious connections with their opposite numbers in other countries. The conscience of an awakened activist cannot be satisfied with a focus on local problems, if only because he sees that local problems are all interconnected with world problems. The young men who are beginning to see that they must refuse to leave their country in order to fight and kill others might decide to leave their country, at least for a while, in order to share their life with others. There is as yet not even an outline in existence of what structure this growing world consciousness might find for itself. But a dozen years ago, there was not even an outline for the Negro civil rights movement in its first phase. The spirit is awake now, structures will follow. If we keep our ears open to the spirit, perhaps the structural forms will emerge from other countries, propelled by another experience of the shaping of history. But we do not have much time. The revolutionary spirit is already worldwide. If the anger of the peoples of the world at the injustice of things is to be channeled into a revolution of love and creativity, we must begin now to work urgently with all the peoples to shape a new world.
Dr. Martin Luther King.
This video is titled Martin Luther King Jr. was an image created by the federal government. Before starting this video, I must say that my iPhone is being tampered with and someone is watching my every word somehow. I'm not joking. I received notifications of another device being used on my Notepad account, and I don't have another device. But the information must be released, no matter the consequences. Going straight in. Before I get into why, I will give a brief history of the personage referred to as Martin Luther King Jr. Any thinking man, woman, or child will be able to discern how the history will give birth to the conclusion. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. King, a Baptist minister and civil rights activist, had a seismic impact on race relations in the United States beginning in the mid-1950s. Among his many efforts, King headed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Through his activism and inspirational speeches, he played a pivotal role in ending the legal segregation of African American citizens in the United States, as well as the creation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. King received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, among several other honors. He was assassinated in April 1968 and continues to be remembered as one of the most influential and inspirational African American leaders in history. In his early years, Martin Luther King was born as Michael King Jr. I gotta pause. Who knew that Martin Luther King's name was not Martin Luther King? He was born as Michael King Jr. on January 15, 1929. Martin Luther King Jr. was the middle child of Michael King Sr. and Alberta Williams King. The King and Williams families were rooted in rural Georgia. Martin Jr.'s grandfather, A.D. Williams, was a rural minister for years and then moved to Atlanta in 1893. He took over the small, struggling Ebenezer Baptist Church with around 13 members and made it into a forceful congregation. He married Janine Celeste Parks and they had one child that survived, Alberta. Michael King Sr. came from a sharecropper family in a poor farming community. He married Alberta in 1926 after an 8-year courtship. The newlyweds moved to A.D. Williams' home in Atlanta. Michael King Sr. stepped in as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church upon the death of his father-in-law in 1931. He too became a successful minister and adopted the name Martin Luther King Sr. in honor of the German Protestant religious leader Martin Luther. In due time, Michael Jr. would follow his father's lead and adopt the name himself. Martin Sr. was more the disciplinarian, while his wife's gentleness easily balanced out the father's more strict hand. Though they undoubtedly tried, Martin Jr.'s parents couldn't shield him completely from racism. Martin Luther King Sr. fought against racial prejudice not just because his race suffered, but because he considered racism and segregation to be an affront to God's will. He strongly discouraged any sense of class superiority in his children, which left a lasting impression on Martin Jr. In 1948, Martin Luther King Jr. earned a sociology degree from Morehouse College and attended the liberal Quaker Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania. He thrived in all his studies and was valedictorian of his class in 1951. Elected student body president, he also earned a fellowship for graduate study. But Martin also rebelled against his father's more conservative influence by drinking beer and playing pool while at college. He became involved with a white woman and went through a difficult time before he could break off the affair. During his last year in seminary, Martin Luther King Jr. came under the guidance of Morehouse College President Benjamin E. Mays, who influenced King's spiritual development. Mays was an outspoken advocate for racial equality and encouraged King to view Christianity as a potential force for social change. That's a key factor. After being accepted at several colleges for his doctoral study, including Yale and Edinburgh in Scotland, King enrolled at Boston University. In 1954, while still working on his dissertation, King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church of Montgomery, Alabama. He completed his Ph.D. and earned his degree in 1955. King was only 25 years old. See, 1955 is the year Rosa Parks bus incident happened in December 1955. King was put at a lead role in organizing and leading the bus boycott because at the time, Negroes, or whatever name they called us, Southern niggas at the time, LOL, we all indigenous, but we all think we know of that incident so well, so I'll skip it for now. Moving along. In January 1957, Martin Luther King Jr., Ralph Abernathy, and 60 ministers and civil rights activists founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to harness the moral authority and organizing power of black churches. They would help conduct nonviolent protests to promote civil rights reform. They would help conduct nonviolent protests to promote civil rights reform. They was promoting that shit. King's participation in the organizing gave him a base of operation throughout the South. You hear that? Base of operation throughout the South. That's government talk. That's Fed talk. As well as a national platform. They mean they want to be, he got to be heard nationally. The organization felt the best place to start to give African Americans a voice was to enfranchise them in the voting process. In February 1958, the SCLC sponsored more than 20 mass meetings in key southern cities to register black voters in the South. King met with religious and civil rights leaders and lectured all over the country on race-related issues. This is a key right here because this is a fact that is little known that took place after the sit-in arrest on October 19th. Martin Luther King was on probation. King was in prison for violating his probation on a traffic conviction. The news of his imprisonment entered the 1960 presidential campaign. Now remember, he already played a key role in getting people to sign up to vote. Now, look at this. The news of his imprisonment entered the 1960 presidential campaign when candidate John F. Kennedy made a phone call to Coretta Scott King. Kennedy expressed his concern for King's harsh treatment for the traffic ticket, and political pressure was quickly set in motion. King was soon released. See, that political pressure is a tantamount moving force in America. In the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. organized a demonstration in downtown Birmingham, Alabama. Entire families attended. City police turned dogs and fire hoses on demonstrators. Martin Luther King was jailed along with large numbers of his supporters, but the event drew nationwide attention. However, King was personally criticized by black and white clergy alike for taking risks and endangering the children who attended the demonstration. From the jail in Birmingham, King eloquently spelled out his theory of nonviolence. Nonviolence direct action seeks to create such a crisis and foster such a tension that a community which has constantly refused to negotiate is forced to confront the issue. By the end of the Birmingham campaign, Martin Luther King Jr. and his supporters were making plans for a massive demonstration on the nation's capital composed of multiple organizations, all asking for peaceful change. On August 28, 1963, the historic March on Washington drew more than 200,000 people in the shadow of Lincoln Memorial. It was here that King made his famous I Have a Dream speech, emphasizing his belief that someday all men could be brothers. This led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, authorizing the federal government to enforce desegregation of public accommodations and outlawing discrimination in publicly owned facilities. This also led to Martin Luther King receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. See, this next act is what got the black, or whatever they want to call us back then, but I'll use it for now. This next pin on the storyline is what brought in a nationwide black mentality of letting go and letting God, which brings in a submissiveness of warriors of color to be docile or timid nature it is constantly mistaken for being humble when 95% of our people, whatever you want to call us, are passive. which is totally against our indigenous nature. But back to the topic at hand. I'm growing tired of history, but I'm almost done. Okay, on March 21st, 1965, approximately 2,000 people began a march from Selma to the Capitol in Montgomery. On March 25th, the number of marchers, which had grown to an estimated 25,000, gathered in front of the state capitol where Dr. King delivered a televised speech. 5 months after the historic peaceful protest, President Johnson signed the 1965 Voting Rights Act. From late 1965 through 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. expanded his civil rights efforts into other larger American cities, including Chicago and Los Angeles. This is the problem with Chicago and Los Angeles now. We're the biggest gangbanging and gunslinging cities in America. But he met with increasing criticism and public challenges from young black power leaders. King's patient, nonviolent approach and appeal to white middle-class citizens alienated many black militants who considered his methods too weak, too late, and ineffective. These black militants were Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple of America, and also the Five Percenters. See, now comes the reason why he was assassinated. King began making a link between discrimination and poverty, and he began to speak out against the Vietnam War. See, that's a big no-no. Never speak out against the white man's war, the European war, never. He felt that America's involvement in Vietnam was politically untenable, and the government's conduct in the war discriminatory to the poor. He sought to broaden his base by forming a multi-race coalition to address economic and unemployment problems of all disadvantaged people. Don't this sound familiar, everybody? This sounds just like the Malcolm X situation where he went abroad and started worrying about overseas stuff and trying to get coalitions with mixed groups of people, and the white man don't like that. The devil don't like that. By 1968, the years of demonstrations and confrontations were beginning to wear on Martin Luther King Jr. He had grown tired of marches, going to jail, and living under the constant threat of death. He was becoming discouraged at the slow progress of civil rights in America and the increasing criticism from other African American leaders. Plans were in the works for another march on Washington to revive his movement and bring attention to a widening range of issues. In the spring of 1968, a labor strike by Memphis sanitation workers drew King to one last crusade. On April 3rd, he gave his final and what proved to be an eerily prophetic speech, "I've Been to the Mountaintop," in which he told supporters at the Mason Temple in Memphis. See, what is he doing at a Masonic temple in Memphis? He was a Mason, everybody. For people that didn't know, he was a Prince Hall Mason. "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land." The next day, while standing on a balcony outside his room at the Lorraine Motel, Martin Luther King Jr. was struck by a sniper's bullet. In the 1970s, FBI files released under the Freedom of Information Act revealed that he was under government surveillance and suggested his involvement in adulterous relationships and communist influences. See, that's the little game. I got another video where I talk about wiretapping, and I stated in there that they were watching this man and listening to his phone calls from 1963 all the way to 1966. I firmly believe from whenever the man was born to when the man died or disappeared, whether he's dead or not. See, this is just part of the imagery that was Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Christian, but more than that, he was Christ-like in the form of yet another federal government-made image. All the images of the government have federal holidays. I mentioned Christian and Christ-like because Christ means to smear, as in smear oil on your forehead or smear ashes on your forehead, like mark a cross on you, like smear campaign, like to down talk somebody, to whisper, to backbite, the stuff they talk about in the Quran. Or X as in Xmas or unknown mass. Christmas is the real black mass, by the way, but that's another thing for another day. But this is December, so I must let you know that Christmas is a black mass and everybody participating in it is participating in black magic. After the federal government creates an image and it serves its uses, no matter how good they served them, how well they portrayed their image, the smear campaign must follow. That's food for thought right there. For anyone who actually listened to the history segment of this video, the conclusion I'm about to state will be redundant. For those who skipped or couldn't discern what I have said, I must state that the federal government constantly creates and destroys images used to convey various messages and set social standards in all communities, in all countries, in all governments. It's the way they govern. Martin Luther King was not his name, but it is the image that is remembered and celebrated, not the man. These images are not new. They have been used since time began. They used the image of Martin Luther King for the sole purpose of making an indigenous warrior race along with our warrior relatives from Africa, though few as the Africans were out here in America. Through the image of MLK, we were groomed to be submissive and give up our natural warrior selves and our self-sufficiency. His dream painted a picture that integration would benefit us, when in all actuality it only benefits the conqueror, because it wasn't just the immigrant Europeans who are now operating under the misnomer of white Americans. It wasn't only them that wanted to be segregated. We wanted separation. It was us, the indigenous natives, who wanted and needed segregation to survive and continue. See, through the image of Dr. King, the indigenous were cheated out of America. This desegregation was the biggest blow to the indigenous of this land. It firmly integrated the European immigrant into American culture and society. I know I'm the first to say this, bro. That's because these dudes who are so-called viral on these various platforms are created federal government images themselves. Yeah, I said it and I stand on it, and by that, if someone is teaching any school of thought or any group of black, brown, aboriginal, African commission, whatever, any group of anybody, and they aren't exposing the fact that these people be plants and that through imagery anybody can be anything and anybody, then they are plants and agents and just images themselves, whether they know it or not. Whether they like it or not. I've been offered the path many of times. I won't let myself be fake for nothing. For no amount of money, I refuse to be fake. I'm only me, indigenous realist, and I plan on exposing images created by and for government purposes to control, trick, and train our youth and us, period. The indigenous are on the rise, and I fly high on eagle wings. Some may understand everything I said, but it will fly over a lot of heads. I'm gone. I don't want to say too much and be killed or sacrificed. Not kidding. It's Indigenous Realist. Please like and share this video. Comment section is open to anyone. Positive or negative comments, it doesn't matter. The truth will be told. Either way, truth will be told on my channel. Subscribe and be on the lookout for new videos I have on the way about other images that were created by the conqueror to rule the conquered. I'm gone.
Through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And I come here tonight and plead with you. Believe in yourself and believe that you're somebody. As I said to a group last night, nobody else can do this for us. No document can do this for us. No Lincolnian Emancipation Proclamation can do this for us. No Kennysonian or Johnsonian civil rights bill can do this for us. If the Negro is to be free, he must move down into the inner resources of his own soul and sign with a pen and ink of self-assertive manhood his own Emancipation Proclamation. Don't let anybody take your manhood. Be proud of our heritage. As somebody said earlier tonight, we don't have anything to be ashamed of. Somebody told a lie one day. They couched it in language. They made everything black, ugly, and evil. Look in your dictionary and see the synonyms of the word black. It's always something degrading and low and sinister. Look at the word white. It's always something pure.
What's up, everybody? It's Indigenous Realist the Realist. When we hear the name of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it is synonymous with segregation and the I Had a Dream speech. We are not used to hearing him being called Michael King, nor are we used to hearing him speak in the manner he just spoke. The majority of us, that is. But in all actuality, this is the way I feel that this brother would have rather spoke. It is not as sensationalized as the integration talk, nor the turn the other cheek shenanigans that he was forced and scripted to speak about in public. See, integration was a bigger atrocity to our people than slavery, but the biggest atrocity ever committed on this soil was the stealing of our true identity as the original inhabitants of this land. Please subscribe and enjoy this video and share it to your loved ones, because this is a message that is being highly censored and the most gruesomely hidden from our people.
100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land.
Some of you may know my works, some may not. All will know eventually that I am not a yes man nor a cloud chaser. With that being said, the speech you all heard has been sensationalized by our people, and they will even go as far as to say that this should suffice as atonement for Martin Luther King's lead role in propagating desegregation and civil rights over human rights. But I firmly disagree. Listen to the rest of the speech, then listen to the wise words of another man from that same day and age.
The Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
To understand this, you have to go back to what young brother here referred to as the house Negro and the field Negro back during slavery. There was two kinds of slaves. There was the house Negro and the field Negro. The house Negro, they lived in the house. with master. They dressed pretty good. They ate good because they ate his food, what he left. They lived in the attic or the basement, but still they lived near their master. And they loved their master more than the master loved himself. They would give their life to save their master's house quicker than the master would. The house Negro, if the master said, we got a good house here, the house Negro say, yeah, we got a good house here. Whenever the master said we, he said we. That's how you can tell a house Negro. If the master's house caught on fire, the house Negro would fight harder to put the blaze out than the master would. If the master got sick, the house Negro would say, what's the matter, boss? We sick. We sick. He identified himself with his master more than his master identified with himself. And if you came to the house Negro and said, let's run away, let's escape, let's separate, that house Negro would look at you and say, man, you crazy. What you mean separate? Where is there a better house than this? Where can I wear better clothes than this? Where can I eat better food than this? That was that house Negro. In those days, he was called a house nigger. And that's what we call him today, because we still got some house niggers running around here. This modern house Negro loves his master. He wants to live near him. He'll pay 3 times as much as the house is worth just to live near his master. And then brag about, I'm the only Negro out here. I'm the only one on my job. I'm the only one in this school. You're nothing but a house Negro. And if someone come to you right now and say, let's separate, you say the same thing that the house Negro said on the plantation. What you mean separate? From America? This good white man? Where you gonna get a better job than you get here? I mean, this is what you say. I ain't left nothing in Africa. That's what you say, while you left your mind in Africa.
See, a lot of people would call Frederick Douglass a coon, and the reason being because he didn't believe, nor did he teach that we were from Africa, nor that we were Africans, nor that Africa was our native land. And he wrote about it in a speech, The Folly of Colonization by Frederick Douglass, January 9th, 1894. Before giving excerpts from The Folly of Colonization, I want to share a few notable quotes by Frederick Douglass. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did and it never will. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. The limits of tyrants are prescribed by the endurance of those whom they oppress. Without a struggle, there can be no progress. The soul that is within me, no man can degrade. At a time like this, scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. We have to do with the past only as we can make it useful to the present and the future. Those who profess to favor freedom and yet depreciate agitation are men who want crops without plying up the ground. I prayed for 20 years but received no answer until I prayed with my legs. With those fiery quotes in mind, let's gather some wisdom from his Folly of Colonization speech. It is the proposition to colonize the colored people of America and Africa or somewhere else. Happily, this scheme will be defeated, both by its impolicy and its impracticability. It is all nonsense to talk about the removal of 8 million of the American people from their homes in America to Africa. The expense and hardships, to say nothing of the cruelty attendant to such a measure, would make success impossible. Nevertheless, This colonizing scheme, unworthy as it is of American statesmanship and American honor, and though full of mischief to the colored people, seems to have a strong hold on the public mind. At times has shown much life and vigor. The bad thing about it is that it has of late, owing to persecution, begun to be advocated by colored men of acknowledged ability and learning. In every little while, some white statesman becomes its advocates. Those gentlemen will doubtless have their opinions of me. I certainly have mine of them. My opinion is that if they are sensible, they are insincere. And if they are insincere, they are not sensible. He goes on to say, they know, or they ought to know, that it would take more money than the cost of the late war to transport even one half of the colored people of the United States to Africa. Whether intentionally or not, they are, as I think, simply trifling with an afflicted people. They urge them to look for relief where they ought to know that relief is impossible. The only excuse they can make for the measure is that there is no hope for the Negro here, and that the colored people in America owe something to Africa. This last sentiment idea makes colonization very fascinating to the dreamers of both colors, but there is really no foundation for it. They tell us that we owe something to our native land. This sounds well, but when the fact is brought to view, which should never be forgotten, that a man can only have one native land, and that is the land in which he is born, the bottom falls entirely out of this sentimental argument. I know, y'all, let me pause. This sounds familiar, right? This sounds just like the Pan-African movement, which is also has grown out of this movement here, but I'm going to go ahead and go. Africa, according to her colonization advocates, is by no means modest in her demands upon us. She calls upon us to send her only best of our men. She does not want our riffraff, but our best men. But these are just the men who are valuable and who are wanted at home. Advocates want not only the best, but millions of the best. Better still, they want the United States government to vote the money to send them there. They do not seem to see that if the government votes money to send the Negro to Africa, that the government may employ means to complete the arrangement and compel us to go. See, I'm going to pause right there, and I'm going to read some more of the speech in a second. I also will be leaving the link to the speech in the description. But we got to realize, y'all, that the Pan-African movement, what they're not getting is we're at a point in time where we know that our heritage is right here in America, and that America is the only place we ever knew. But at the same time, even Frederick Douglass, way back in 1894, he knew that the government could use that to make the arrangement and compel us to go to Africa, a land we've never been to. I'll come back to Frederick Douglass' speech, but until then, check this out.
We say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life, longevity, has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I'm a field Negro. The masses are the field Negroes. When they see this man's house on fire, you don't hear these little Negroes talking about our government is in trouble. They say the government is in trouble. Imagine a Negro, our government. I even heard one say our astronauts. They won't even let him near the plant. And our astronauts, our Navy, that's a Negro that's out of his mind. That's a Negro that's out of his mind. Just as the slave master in that day used Tom, the house Negro, to keep the field Negroes in check, the same old slave master today has Negroes who are nothing but modern Uncle Toms, 20th century Uncle Toms, to keep you and me in check, keep us under control, keep us passive and peaceful and nonviolent. That's Tom making you nonviolent. It's like when you go to the dentist and the man is going to take your tooth. You're going to fight him when he starts pulling. So they squirt some stuff in your jaw called Novocaine to make you think they're not doing anything to you. So you sit there and because you got all that Novocaine in your jaw, you suffer peacefully. Blood running all down your jaw. And you don't know what's happening. Because someone has taught you to suffer peacefully. The white man do the same thing to you in the street. When he gonna want to put knots on your head and take advantage of you and don't have to be afraid of you fighting back. To keep you from fighting back, he get these old religious Uncle Toms to teach you and me. They're just like Novocaine, suffer peacefully. Don't stop suffering, just suffer peacefully. As Reverend Cleave pointed out, let your blood flow in the streets. This is a shame. And you know he's a Christian preacher. If it's a shame to him, you know what it is to me.
Okay, here's some more words from Frederick Douglass speak. Now, I hold that the American Negro owes no more to the Negroes in Africa than he owes to the Negroes in America. There are millions of needy people over there, but there are also millions of needy people over here as well. And the millions in America need intelligent men of their own number to help them as much as intelligent men are needed in Africa to help her people. Besides, we have a fight on our hands right here, a fight for the redemption of the whole race. And a blow struck successfully for the Negro in America is a blow struck successfully for the Negro in Africa. For until the Negro is respected in America, he need not expect consideration elsewhere. All this native land talk, however, is nonsense. The native land of the American Negro is America. His bones, his muscle, his sinews are all American. And he goes on to say, every man who thinks at all must know that home is the fountainhead, the inspiration, the foundation, and main support, not only of all the social virtue, but of all motives to human progress, and that no people can prosper or amount to much unless they have a home or the hope of a home. All right, I'm going to skip through. And he also goes on to say, a man has not such an object either in possession or in prospect, is a nobody, will never be anything else. To have a home, the Negro must have a country, and he is an enemy to the moral progress of the Negro, whether he knows it or not, who calls upon him to break up his home in this country for an uncertain home in Africa. But even the Southern whites have an interest in this question. Woe to the South when it no longer has the strong arm of the Negro to till its soil. And woe to the nation when it should employ the sword to derive the Negro from his native land. Now I know a lot of people are wondering what Frederick Douglass's words have to do with Martin Luther King when he died long before King was even born. Well, the link between the two is that he was also assassinated for telling the truth of so-called blacks and so-called Negroes being aboriginal or indigenous to this land, just as Martin Luther King was. See, this video isn't a bash on Dr. Martin Luther King at all. I do know that King was a part of the federal government created imagery program, which used figures of standing in the so-called Negro community to be tricked and swayed into being other than themselves and conforming to white supremacy ideas and ideologies. But don't believe me. Listen to Malcolm X expose the funding and infiltration of prominent groups like civil rights, NAACP, etc.
And dressed him well and fed him well and even gave him a little education. Gave him a long coat and a top hat and made all the other slaves look up to him. Then he used Tom to control them. The same strategy that was used in those days is used today by the same white man. He take a Negro, so-called Negro, and make him prominent, build him up, publicize him, make him a celebrity, and then he becomes a spokesman for Negroes and a Negro leader. I would like to just mention one thing else quickly, and that is the method that the white man uses, how the white man uses these big guns or Negro leaders against the black revolution. They are not a part of the black revolution. They're used against the black revolution. When Martin Luther King failed to desegregate Albany, Georgia, the civil rights struggle in America reached its low point. King became bankrupt almost as a leader. Plus, even financially, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was in financial trouble. Plus, it was in trouble, period, with the people when they failed to desegregate Albany, Georgia. Other Negro civil rights leaders of so-called national stature became fallen idols. As they became fallen idols, began to lose their prestige and influence, local Negro leaders began to stir up the masses. In Cambridge, Maryland, Gloria Richardson. In Danville, Virginia, and other parts of the country, local leaders began to stir up our people at the grassroots level. This was never done by these Negroes whom you recognize of national stature. They controlled you, but they never incited you or excited you. They controlled you, they contained you. They kept you on the plantation. As soon as King failed in Birmingham, Negroes took to the streets. King got out and went out to California to a big rally and raised about, I don't know how many thousands of dollars. Come to Detroit and had a march and raised some more thousands of dollars. And recall, right after that, Wilkins attacked King, accused King and the Corps of starting trouble everywhere and then making the NAACP get him out of jail and spend a lot of money, and then he accused King and Corps of raising all the money and not paying it back. This happened. I got it in documented evidence in the newspaper. Roy started attacking King, and King started attacking Roy, and Farmer started attacking both of them. And as these Negroes of national stature begin to attack each other, they begin to lose their control of the Negro masses. And Negroes was out there in the streets. They was talking about, we're going to march on Washington. By the way, and right at that time, Birmingham had exploded, and the Negroes in Birmingham, remember, they also exploded. They began to stab the crackers in the back and bust them upside the head. Yes, they did. That's when Kennedy sent in the troops down in Birmingham. So, and right after that, Kennedy got on the television and said, this is a moral issue. That's when he said he's going to put out a civil rights bill. And when he mentioned civil rights bill and the Southern crackers started talking about they were going to boycott it or filibuster it, then the Negroes started talking about what? We're going to march on Washington, march on the Senate, march on the White House, march on the Congress, and tie it up, bring it to a halt. Don't let the government proceed. They even said they was going to go out to the airport and lay down on the runway and don't let no airplanes land. I'm telling you what they said. That was revolution. That was revolution. That was the black revolution. It was the grassroots out there in the street. Scared the white man to death. Scared the white power structure in Washington, D.C. to death. I was there. When they found out that this black steamroller was going to come down on the Capitol, they called in Wilkins. They called in Randolph. They called in these national Negro leaders that you respect and told them, call it off. Kennedy said, look, you all letting this thing go too far. And old Tom said, boss, I can't stop it because I didn't start it. I'm telling you what they said. They said, I'm not even in it, much less at the head of it. They said, these Negroes are doing things on their own. They're running ahead of us. And that old shrewd fox, he said, well, if you all aren't in it, I'll put you in it. I'll put you at the head of it. I'll endorse it. I'll welcome it. I'll help it. I'll join it. A matter of hours went by. They had a meeting at the Carlisle Hotel in New York City. The Carlisle Hotel is owned by the Kennedy family. That's the hotel Kennedy spent the night at 2 nights ago. Belongs to his family. Philanthropic society headed by a white man named Stephen Currier called all the top civil rights leaders together at the Carlisle Hotel and told them that by you all fighting each other, you're destroying the civil rights movement. And since you're fighting over money from white liberals, let us set up what's known as the Council for United Civil Rights Leadership. Let's form this council, and all the civil rights organizations will belong to it. And we'll use it for fundraising purposes. Let me show you how tricky the white man is. And as soon as they got it formed, they elected Whitney Young as the chairman. And who you think became the co-chairman? Stephen Currier, the white man. A millionaire. Powell was talking about it down at the Cobo today. This is what he was talking about. Powell knows it happened. Randolph knows it happened. Wilkins knows it happened. King knows it happened. Every one of that so-called Big Six. They know what happened. Once they formed it, with the white man over it, he promised them and gave them $800,000 to split up between the Big Six, and told them that after the march was over, they'd give them $700,000 more. $1.5 million split up between leaders that you've been following, going to jail for, crying crocodile tears for, and they've nothing but Frank James and Jesse James and brothers. Soon as they got the setup organized, the white men made available to them top public relations experts. Opened the news media across the country at their disposal. And then they began to project these Big Six as the leaders of the march. Originally, they weren't even in the march. You was talking this march talk on Hastings Street. Is Hastings Street still here? On Hastings Street. You was talking the march talk on Lenox Avenue. And down on, Fillmore Street. And Central Avenue. And 42nd Street and 63rd Street. That's where the march talk was being talked. But the white man put the big six ahead of it, made them the march. They became the march. They took it over. And the first move they made after they took it over, they invited Walter Reuther, a white man. They invited a priest, a rabbi, and an old white preacher. Yes, an old white preacher. The same white element that put Kennedy in power, labor, the Catholics, the Jews, and liberal Protestants. Same clique that put Kennedy in power joined the March on Washington. With the March on Washington, they joined it. They didn't integrate it, they infiltrated it. They joined it, became a part of it, took it over. And as they took it over, it lost its militancy. They ceased to be angry. They ceased to be hot. They ceased to be uncompromising. Why, it even ceased to be a march. It became a picnic, a circus. Nothing but a circus with clowns and all. You had one right here in Detroit. I saw it on television with clowns leading it, white clowns and black clowns. I know you don't like what I'm saying, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because I can prove what I'm saying. If you think I'm telling you wrong, you bring me Martin Luther King and A. Philip Randolph and James Farmer and those other three, and see if they'll deny it over a microphone. No, it was a sellout. It was a takeover. When James Baldwin came in from Paris, they wouldn't let him talk because they couldn't make him go by the script. Burt Lancaster read the speech that Baldwin was supposed to make. They wouldn't let Baldwin get up there because they know Baldwin liable to say anything. They controlled it so tight, they told those Negroes what time to hit town, how to come, where to stop, what sign to carry, what song to sing, what speech they could make and what speech they couldn't make, and then told them to get out of town by sundown. It's just like when you got some coffee that's too black, which means it's too strong. What you do, you integrate it with cream. You make it weak. If you pour too much cream in, you won't even know you ever had coffee. It used to be hot, it becomes cool. It used to be strong, it becomes weak. It used to wake you up, now it'll put you to sleep.